The president oversees dozens of agencies and departments, including cabinet departments, each of which has its own head. These agencies and departments are created by Congress, but they report to the president. Article 2 of the Constitution gives the president the power to appoint cabinet officials with the advice and consent of the Senate, meaning that cabinet officials and many other executive branch officers require a majority vote of the Senate to ratify their nominations. Among the ways in which Donald Trump has challenged conventional norms in his second term are many of his executive branch appointments. Several members of both the cabinet and the executive office of the presidency have been criticized for being severely underqualified. These include Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, a former Fox News correspondent with no significant administrative experience and ties to white nationalists. Robert Kennedy Jr. was picked to head Health and Human Services, even though he's not a doctor and despite his many anti-vaccine and anti-scientific views. Tulsi Gabbard was picked as Director of National Intelligence, despite having no experience in intelligence and concerns that she may be compromised by Russia, Syria, or other nations. Linda McMahon, the former head of the World Wrestling Federation, was picked to head the Department of Education, despite having no background in education and having spent her career in professional wrestling.
Whether or not you agree with these appointments, however, they raise no problem from a constitutional perspective. A president is entitled to have cabinet officers who share his views and endorse his agenda. However, constitutional disputes do exist about the president's ability to fire executive branch officials. The Constitution is silent about whether Congress can limit or restrict the president's ability to fire people. After the Civil War, President Ulysses S. Grant and Congress were engaged in a bitter struggle over the extent of Reconstruction. In order to restrict Grant's power, Congress voted in favor of the Tenure of Office Act of 1867, which required Senate approval before the president could fire any Senate officer who had originally been confirmed by the Senate. Johnson vetoed this bill, but Congress passed it over his veto. Johnson then fired his Secretary of War without Senate approval. The House of Representatives voted to impeach Johnson as a result, making him the first president to be impeached. However, he was acquitted by the Senate, and the Supreme Court never ruled on the constitutionality of the Tenure of Office Act, which was eventually repealed.
Approximately 100 years ago, the Supreme Court finally addressed the issue of presidential firing power in a pair of seemingly contradictory decisions. In 1926, the court decided Myers v. U.S., which involved a law that required Senate approval before the president could fire a postmaster, who was an official responsible for postal operations within a designated area. The court said, quote, "Made responsible under the Constitution for the effective enforcement of the law, the president needs as an indispensable aid to meet it the disciplinary influence upon those who act under him of a reserve power of removal." In other words, what motivates presidential appointees to do their jobs well is the fear of hearing the words,
"Christine, you're fired!"
The court appeared to contradict itself less than 10 years later in Humphrey's Executor v. U.S. In this case, a federal law said that the president could only fire members of the Federal Trade Commission for cause, which means for specific things such as incompetence, malfeasance, or dereliction of duty. William Humphrey was a member of the Federal Trade Commission. He was also a conservative Republican, staunchly opposed to new President Franklin Roosevelt's agenda. Roosevelt asked Humphrey to resign. After Humphrey refused, Roosevelt fired him, even though Humphrey had not demonstrated any incompetence, malfeasance, or dereliction of duty. Humphrey filed a lawsuit seeking his job back, while Roosevelt claimed the law was unconstitutional. However, the Supreme Court disagreed and said that Congress could restrict the president's power to fire certain agency officials. In other words, Congress has the right to decide that some policy decisions should be left to people who are thinking primarily about the public interest rather than the political agenda of the president. As just one example, one of the responsibilities of the Federal Reserve is to set interest rates. They try to adjust these rates to keep the U.S. economy in balance over the medium to long term. These adjustments involve extensive analysis of economic data and extensive knowledge of economic principles. Congress has decided that these decisions should be left to experts rather than presidents, who might decide to manipulate the economy for their own purposes, which is exactly what Donald Trump has tried to do both as a candidate and as president. After many years of very low interest rates, the Federal Reserve started to raise interest rates in March 2022 in order to combat high inflation. By design, interest rates tend to lead to lower levels of growth and make homes more expensive. In the summer of 2024, inflation had cooled down, and Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell indicated that the Fed would likely reduce interest rates. This would have the effect of helping the sitting president, Joe Biden, and harming Donald Trump's presidential campaign. He therefore demanded that the Fed refuse to raise interest rates, putting his own presidential campaign above the economy. However, Powell refused to bow to political pressure since he can't be fired except for cause, and the Fed lowered interest rates anyway. Trump changed his tune after he took office for the second time in 2025. Because lower interest rates would now benefit him politically, he switched his position and called upon the Fed to lower interest rates. When the Fed did not do what he demanded, he publicly threatened to fire Powell, despite the law that forbids him from doing so. Trump backed off from his threat after the markets tanked as a result, but he continued to rage at Powell. Could Trump actually fire Powell despite the law? That's the subject of our next video.